My name is Sophia Carver. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life I was a school librarian in Cedar Glen, Pennsylvania. The kind of woman whose days were measured in the smell of old paper, the soft creak of library chairs, and the rhythmic stamping of due dates that gave order to chaos. Retirement has given me mornings of weak tea on the porch, the local paper folded into precise quarters, and the sound of sparrows fussing at the feeder, a slower rhythm than the school bells, but one that suits me just the same. Since my husband passed 12 years ago, I have tried to keep life simple. Rooted in the steady routines of small-town America, where people wave from porches and the grocer knows which jam you prefer, where history clings to sidewalks and everyone has an opinion about everyone else. Yet in all my quiet, nothing prepared me for the sting of words from my own family, the kind that cut sharper than any paper edge I ever handled. It happened on one of those Sunday lunches I had always thought of as family glue, when roast chicken and mashed potatoes filled the table, and laughter was supposed to cover every unspoken tension. Evan, my only child at 38, sat there, twirling his fork, his silence always the way he avoided storms, while Lara, his wife of 6 years, smiled brightly for the neighbors who had dropped by for dessert, pouring coffee with a hostess's poise. It was only when the kitchen door swung shut behind us, when the hum of conversation in the dining room blurred to a distant murmur, that she leaned toward me, her perfume too sharp, her smile still frozen in place for show, and whispered a sentence so vicious it seemed to still the air around us. "Go die quietly," she said, as if the words were nothing more than a practical suggestion, as if my existence were an inconvenience she was ready to erase. I stood there, holding a stack of plates, their edges digging into my palm, and felt my body go rigid, the way a tree stiffens under the first lash of a storm. For a moment I thought surely Evan would rush in, that he had heard, that he would put an end to such cruelty. But the kitchen door stayed closed, and I knew he would remain as he always was, passive in the face of her sharpness. I set the plates down gently, unwilling to let them crash, and straightened my shoulders. In that moment, I understood that silence was the gift Lara expected, and it was the only one I would never give her again. This time, I would not swallow the insult, nor bury it in the soil of family peace. This time, I would answer her, not with rage, but with proof, preparation, and a resolve she would never see coming. For years, I told myself I was only being a mother, that the money I gave or lent was no more than an extension of love, a bridge to help my son and his wife steady themselves in the uncertain years of adulthood. But the truth is that each time I opened my wallet, I also opened my notebook, the same marbled spiral I had once used for cataloguing overdue books at the library. And into it, I wrote every dollar, every date, every promise of repayment that Lara insisted was only temporary. When their rent fell short during Evan's layoff, I covered it, noting the amount with a neat line of blue ink, circling his assurance that they would repay me in 3 months. When Lara dented her car and the deductible came due, she called it a small emergency, and I put the bill on my card, writing the charge alongside her text message that said, "Thank you, we'll pay back soon." When she leased her boutique space, all glossy mirrors and soft velvet lighting, she called one evening, her voice sugar-sweet, asking if I could float the first few weeks until her suppliers came through. And again I said yes, though my hand trembled as I wrote the sum in the notebook, because I knew what she did not say out loud, that my money was her cushion and my trust her currency. Over time, the pages thickened with entries, copies of bank transfers, printouts of emails where Lara promised repayment dates that slipped by unnoticed, and though she laughed to others about how generous her mother-in-law was, I never laughed. because the truth waited for me in black ink, silent and undeniable, a record of debts disguised as gifts. I kept the notebook hidden in the drawer beside my bed, a private ledger that no one else knew about. The paper edges worn from my thumb, tracing them on nights when sleep would not come, when I wondered whether my giving was kindness or foolishness, whether my son even knew the weight of obligation that hung in my chest. Each page reminded me that love and money, once mixed, can sour into resentment, that help offered too freely can become chains around your own ankles. I was not bitter then, not yet. But I understood something was shifting, that Lara's gratitude was skin deep and her memory selective. And so I wrote everything down, line by careful line, not because I planned revenge, but because I sensed one day I would need proof that I had not imagined it, that the taking had been real, and that my silence had not erased the truth. The morning I carried my notebook into Monica Reyes's office, I felt the weight of every entry pressed against my chest, as though the spiral itself had grown heavier with each debt that had gone unpaid. And stepping through her door felt less like a legal errand, and more like entering a confessional. Monica was 57, with sharp eyes that seemed to read the spaces between my words, and a calm steadiness that made me feel both small and safe, as if nothing I admitted could shock her. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and old leather, the walls lined with tidy shelves of statutes and binders that hummed with authority. I slid the folder across her desk, my hand reluctant to let go, and watched as she leafed through the pages I had guarded for so long. She did not laugh, nor pity, nor dismiss, but instead treated each note and transfer as if it were evidence in a case worth fighting. She explained with a voice that never wavered that debts owed to a person do not vanish with them, that once I was gone they would become debts owed to my estate, collectible like any other liability. She showed me how I could restructure my accounts, sever joint ownerships that would otherwise flow directly to Evan and Lara, and rewrite my will so that my wishes could not be smothered by assumption. Her pen tapped lightly against the margin of my file as she spoke of trusts, executors, and safeguards, each word like a plank laid across a chasm I had feared was uncrossable. "You cannot change her cruelty," she said finally, lifting her gaze to mine, and the blunt truth of it struck me like a cold draft across the room. But then she added, with the firmness of someone who had seen this pattern too many times, "But you can control what happens after." In that moment, I felt the smallest flicker of power return to me, not the kind that roars or demands, but the quiet, enduring power of preparation, of setting boundaries that will outlive the noise of insults. For the first time since Lara's words scorched me in the kitchen, I could breathe without the taste of defeat. I walked out of that office with my folder tucked under my arm, my steps steadier on the pavement, knowing that while I could not rewrite Lara's nature, I could rewrite my future, and that was enough to begin. There is a kind of grief that comes not with death, but with the slow realization that the people you once believed would protect your name and memory are instead poised to exploit them. And it was with that grief that I sat in the county clerk's office, pen in hand, severing the joint tenancy on my home, so that when my time came, my half would not slide automatically into the hands of those who had shown me contempt. The papers were dry, legalistic, but I read them as though they were scripture, every line a declaration that I would not be erased, that my choices would stand longer than the smirk on Lara's face or the silence on Evan's lips. I signed my name with a flourish steadier than I felt, transforming the house into tenants in common, a small legal shift with the weight of a revolution, because it meant that my half would go where I directed, not where bloodlines assumed. That same week I sat again with Monica, and together we shaped a will that did not bend to sentiment but to truth, a document that drew a hard boundary between care and exploitation. We funneled my share into a trust designed for those who had truly stood by me. The neighbors who brought soup when I was sick, the library that had been my second home, even a modest fund for the women's shelter, where I had volunteered in my younger years. Evan's name was not absent, because I could not erase the boy I raised, but it was conditional, set so that he could benefit only if he proved himself willing to stand on his own 2 feet, never as a conduit for Lara's greed. I pictured her face when she learned she had no automatic claim to my walls, my porch, my garden, the place where my life had taken root. The thought did not bring me joy so much as peace, the kind of peace that comes from knowing you have shut a door firmly that once swung loose in the wind. Walking home afterward, the November air biting my cheeks, I felt lighter, as if I had shed a heavy coat. The house looked the same from the outside, clapboard painted pale yellow, the front steps sagging just a little, but inside its very bones had shifted. It was no longer a prize to be seized, but a promise safeguarded. And for the first time in years, I felt my home was truly mine again. The first time I walked into Lara's boutique after the papers were signed, I felt as though I was stepping into a theatre. The kind where the velvet curtains are pulled just so, and every light is angled to flatter, a stage built to disguise the scaffolding behind it. Soft music hummed from hidden speakers, candles flickered in glass jars, and racks of dresses shimmered in the low glow. Each tag handwritten in looping script that suggested elegance and care. She greeted customers with a laugh that carried all warmth and polish, and when she saw me, she did not flinch, but called me Mom, in that saccharine tone that played well for an audience, telling anyone within earshot that I was her biggest supporter, that I had made this dream possible. What she did not mention was the ledger in my drawer that bore the truth, that every rack, every light bulb, every mirror leaned not on her cleverness, but on my checks and transfers. As she spun a tale for a young bride about the uniqueness of a silk gown, I slipped away to the back room, where glamour gave way to invoices pinned crookedly on a corkboard, many stamped with the red block letters of overdue. Boxes from suppliers lined the floor, some half opened, packing slips dangling, notes scribbled with promises of payment that matched the empty reassurances she had given me so many times before. I felt the weight of my phone in my hand, and with a steady resolve, I began to snap photographs, not hurriedly, but carefully, capturing the receipts, the notes, the embossed seals of suppliers she had failed to pay. Each click of the camera was a small act of defiance, an insurance policy against her lies, proof that her empire of soft lights and curated scents stood on the brittle stilts of my subsidies. When she breezed in a few minutes later, smiling wide for the woman buying costume jewelry at a premium price, she told her loudly that Mom handled it, waving toward me with the flourish of a woman proud of her benefactor. But this time, I did not shrink. I smiled politely, my phone already tucked in my bag, the images secured, the truth preserved. Walking out into the sunlight, the boutique's facade gleaming behind me, I felt no triumph, only clarity. The store was not a monument to Lara's ambition. It was a facade, and I now carried the photographs that could strip away the velvet and candles to reveal the hollow frame beneath. When I finally sat Evan down, it was not in anger, but in the quiet determination that had been building inside me since that Sunday lunch. And I spoke plainly, laying out the facts of what I had given, what had been promised, and what had been forgotten. But instead of hearing me, he leaned back in his chair with tired eyes and asked if I could let it go for the sake of harmony. Harmony, he called it, as if plastering over rot could make a house sound. And I felt the word roll over my tongue like chalk, dry and bitter, leaving no nourishment, no sweetness, only the reminder that compromise in the face of cruelty is nothing more than surrender. I told him I would not argue, that I was not looking for a shouting match or a courtroom scene, and that I only wanted clarity. That night, after he left, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence, and I composed an email that was steady, polite, and precise. I attached scanned copies of the notebook entries, bank transfers, and even screenshots of texts where Lara herself had written the words "will repay." And I itemized each sum, with dates, noting repayment terms that were not unreasonable, offering a plan that any fair person would accept. When I clicked send, my hands did not shake. It felt like returning a misfiled book to the right shelf, restoring order where chaos had crept in. The next morning, her reply came, and it was only 4 words. Delete my email. No greeting, no argument, no acknowledgement of the truth staring back at her. Just a dismissal as cold as stone. I sat there staring at the screen for a long moment, then quietly hit print, watching the paper slide out, with the ink still warm, and I added it to my growing file. That stack of documents was no longer just a record of money. It was a mirror held up to their choices. A collection of truths that Lara could not delete, no matter how many emails she ordered me to erase. Filing the page into the folder, I felt the same steadiness I once felt shelving books after a storm of children had left them scattered. The mess was not mine, but the order would be, and harmony, the kind that Evan pleaded for, would never again come at the cost of my silence. The day Monica slid the draft of the trust across her desk, I felt as though she had handed me not just papers, but a shield, something forged from all the small humiliations I had swallowed, and the larger betrayals I had finally begun to name. The language was plain, but its meaning was ironclad, spelling out exactly where my portion of the estate would go, and under what terms, so that no smile or sob story could undo it. There was a provision for my grandchild's education, because no matter how strained things had become with his parents, I could not bring myself to punish a child for what he did not choose. There was a grant earmarked for the Cedar Glen Library, the building where I had spent most of my working life, a place that still smelled faintly of ink and dust and whispered memories, because I wanted children long after me to find solace between its shelves. There was a gift to the women's shelter on the edge of town, because I knew too well what silence can do to a woman's spirit, and I wanted to help others find their way back to safety and dignity. Monica had written it so that trustees would be people I trusted, people who could not be bullied or manipulated by crocodile tears or false charm, and she looked me straight in the eye when she told me Lara's name would never appear, not even in the margins. Evan's place was trickier, because he was my son, the boy I had raised, the man who carried both my pride and my disappointment. But I agreed with Monica when she made it conditional, tied not to inheritance by blood, but to his willingness to show respect and civility. If he chose silence in the face of cruelty, if he let Lara's contempt pass unchecked, then he would find his access to the trust closed off, not out of spite, but out of fairness. I sat there, reading each line slowly, savoring the firmness of it, and when I finally signed, my hand did not tremble. I was not writing my vengeance. I was writing my freedom, and for the first time in a long while, I felt as though I had teeth of my own, quiet but unyielding, set to bite back against those who had mistaken my patience for weakness. The first bill I cancelled was the streaming service, the one Lara had set up on my account with the excuse that her card was temporarily maxed out. And as I clicked the button to end it, I felt a strange release, as though I were peeling away a layer of quiet obligation that had clung to me far too long. Next came the car insurance, another temporary favor I had covered during a so-called emergency that stretched into years, the monthly draft pulling from my account as silently as breath. while she drove around town, bragging about her independence. Then it was the storage unit, that cavern of velvet drapes and unused props, meant to make her boutique seem more glamorous than it ever was, paid for in my name under the guise of a short-term solution. Each time I picked up the phone or logged into an account, I wrote the date neatly in my notebook beside the word cancelled, and I savoured the neatness of those lines, the way they looked like small victories strung together. It was not about the money so much as the principle, a reclaiming of space in my own life, proof that I would no longer bankroll someone else's illusions while being told to shrink into silence. The only thread I refused to cut was the grocery delivery for my grandchild when Evan was on his own, because the child had done nothing wrong and I could not bear the thought of him going without a stocked fridge, and so I arranged the orders myself, quietly, and considered it not a subsidy, but a kindness freely chosen. With every cancellation I felt steadier, more rooted, as though I had been drifting for years, and was finally anchoring myself again, no longer bound to Lara's constant taking. I kept the folder growing, each confirmation email printed and slipped behind the debts already documented. Each page, another stone in the wall. I was building to mark the limits of what I would allow. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table with the lamplight spreading over the papers, sipping weak tea, and thought of all the ways I had let myself be chipped away, how every quiet payment had been a silent erasure of my worth. But now the ledger was turning, and the proof was no longer just of what they owed me, but of what I had reclaimed, line by line, until at last my boundaries held like steel. It was a Wednesday evening when I saw her car pull up in front of the house, headlights cutting across the yard in that impatient way of hers. And I knew before she even stepped out what she intended to do, because Lara never announced visits when she thought she owned the space. She walked briskly to the porch, her heels clacking against the wooden steps, and without hesitation slid her spare key into the lock. But instead of the smooth turn she expected, she met resistance, the quiet defiance of a mechanism that no longer recognized her authority. I stood in the doorway just inside, watching her face shift from confusion to irritation, her lips pressing thin as she tried again, twisting harder as though force could undo the boundary I had drawn. The lock held firm, of course, and when the faint beep of the new alarm system sounded in warning, she froze, realizing at last that the door she once treated as her own entry was now beyond her reach. I opened it before the alarm could fully engage, stepping out with a calm she could not rattle. And in my hand was the old keyring she had clung to for years, polished smooth from her careless use. I held it out to her with a gentle smile, not mocking but final, and said simply, "Thank you for the years we tried." There was no shouting, no argument, only the quiet punctuation of a boundary sealed. She stared at me, searching for the fight she wanted, but I offered her none, only the return of what no longer belonged to her. The porch light glowed soft above us, moths circling in their endless dance, and for a moment it felt as if time itself had paused to witness the shift. She took the keys slowly, her hand trembling not with fear but with a fury she could not release, and when she finally turned and walked back down the steps, her shoulders rigid, I felt something inside me loosen. I closed the door behind me, the click of the new lock echoing louder than any slammed argument, and leaned against it with a long breath, knowing that this house, these walls, this life were once again truly mine. A closed door, no longer hers to enter, no longer mine to justify, a final line that even she could not cross again. The day I signed my new will, the air in Monica's office felt heavy with consequence, the blinds drawn just enough to soften the winter light, so that the room seemed cocooned in a stillness that matched the gravity of what we were doing. I sat at the long oak table with two witnesses present, both clerks who had probably overseen hundreds of signatures. Yet to me, it felt as though I were chiseling words into stone, each stroke of my pen carving a truth that could no longer be denied or twisted. Monica laid out the pages in neat order, her steady hands sliding them toward me one by one, explaining in her calm tone how each clause would hold, how each paragraph would stand when tested. My executors were appointed, people I trusted, not for their blood, but for their integrity, neighbors and friends who had shown me kindness when it was not convenient. My funeral wishes were simple. No lavish displays, only a modest service at the church I had attended since girlhood. Hymns I loved, sung plainly, without fuss, and then a burial beside my husband, so that even in rest I would not be alone. The schedule of debts came last, the part of the document that made my chest tighten with both pain and relief. For there, in black and white, were the amounts Lara had borrowed under the guise of temporary help. Her own handwriting on receipts and notes now attached and acknowledged as enforceable. Statutory interest would apply, Monica reminded me, her voice matter of fact. Because money borrowed is not suspended in time. It carries weight as it waits, and my estate would see that accounted for. I paused before writing my name, the nib of the pen hovering as I thought of all the years I had let her convince me to treat those debts as gifts, to swallow my pride and accept her dismissals, but no longer. I signed firmly, not with bitterness, but with clarity, and felt a strange warmth rise through me, the warmth of order restored, of truth preserved. When the witnesses added their names and Monica sealed the final page, I sat back in my chair with the sense that I had at last closed a chapter, one written not in Lara's sharp words, but in my own steady hand. No gift unless proof said otherwise, no silence mistaken for consent, no more shadows where light now fell. The night the ambulance carried me through the snow, I felt my age settle into my bones like ice. And though the doctors spoke briskly of tests and monitoring, I knew it was the kind of scare that reminded you just how thin the line is between the ordinary and the final. The fluorescent lights in the ER hummed above me, cold and unyielding, and I stared at the ceiling tiles as a nurse clipped monitors to my chest. Her hands efficient but kind, and I thought of how little control any of us truly have when our bodies falter. Evan appeared briefly at the foot of the bed, his face pale and worried. Yet even then I could feel the ghost of Lara hovering behind him, her impatience like a shadow, and I realized I had no desire to spend my remaining strength defending myself against her disdain. Instead, when the ward quieted and the machines settled into their steady rhythm, I reached for my phone and pressed record, speaking softly into the darkness. My voice did not tremble as I told Evan I loved him, that he would always be my son, that none of my choices were made to punish but to protect, and that truth was not cruelty but clarity. I made no apologies for safeguarding what I had worked for, no apologies for refusing to fund disrespect, only a plea that he find the courage to build his life on respect rather than silence. When I stopped the recording, my throat tight but steady, I slipped the phone back onto the tray and reached for the folder I had brought with me, the one that lived in my bedside drawer at home, but had come with me tonight out of instinct. I slid in a single handwritten page I had prepared earlier, the letters dark and deliberate. Kindness is not a direct debit. Respect is not on credit. That was the lesson I wanted to leave behind. The summation of years of giving too freely, and finally learning to hold back what was not honored. The night passed slowly, nurses padding in and out, and by dawn the crisis had eased. My heartbeat steadier, my breathing less ragged, but the truth was already preserved. Whether I had 1 year left or 10, the file would speak when I could not, and the voice note would remind Evan of the love I still carried, stripped of bitterness but never of resolve. I have often wondered what the room would feel like when my voice was no longer present to explain myself. When the words I left on paper would have to do the work. I could not. And in the end, it was Monica who carried that weight. Her calm voice steady as she gathered Evan and Lara into her office, months after I slipped quietly from this world. I imagine the light slanting through the blinds, the dust motes hanging still in the air. Lara sitting with her spine stiff, a gleam in her eye that mistook expectation for certainty, already picturing jewels slipped into her hands, or perhaps the deed to my house laid before her. She had practiced that moment in her head, no doubt. And Evan, poor boy, would have sat beside her, half hopeful, half fearful, knowing me well enough to suspect that surprises waited. Monica would have begun with the simple bequests, the gifts written into the trust with deliberate care, the neighbors who had shown me kindness when no one else thought to, the library that held my life's work and needed steady hands to keep its shelves full, the shelter where women searching for safety could find a measure of it, through a donation that would outlast me. I can see Lara's smile falter as each name was read, each gift given to someone outside her grasp, her fingers tightening on her purse strap as though the leather could anchor her. And then Monica would turn the page to the schedule of debts, the part that mattered most, her voice firm as she read out the amounts Lara had borrowed, each figure tied to dates and her own signature, enforceable and no longer dismissible, as the generosity of a foolish old woman. Evan's name appeared, but not in the way Lara expected, because his support came with conditions tied to dignity, to respect, to the proof that he could live without cruelty shaping his choices. No inheritance flowed through Lara, no automatic claim to house or bank, only the mirror of her own taking handed back to her. I imagine the silence after, heavy and unbroken, the moment when pretense peeled away and the truth stood bare in the center of the room. That was the moment I had written toward, not to wound, but to free, to leave behind not bitterness, but balance, and to remind them both that love cannot be taken, only honored. I can see it as if I were still alive. The scene spilling out onto Main Street the morning Lara stormed from Monica's office, her voice sharp enough to slice through the winter air as she accused my solicitor of trickery, her words tumbling one over another in a fury that drew the attention of passers-by and made shop doors swing open with curiosity. Monica, composed as always, did not flinch beneath the barrage, her coat buttoned neatly, her briefcase clasped firmly in her hand, and when Lara shrieked that none of it was fair, that she had been cheated, Monica simply raised her chin and said in that calm, steady voice, "These are your signatures, Mrs. Carver. The estate must collect for all beneficiaries." The words were not cruel, only precise, and in their precision, they cut deeper than any insult Lara hurled. I imagine the color rising in her face, the stomp of her heel against the pavement, the way she grasped for the sympathy of strangers who only saw a woman unraveling under the weight of her own greed. And then, as if summoned by the scent of blood in the water, the suppliers she had evaded began to surface, their letters and phone calls no longer deflected by my quiet subsidies, their patience frayed now that the cushion of my money was gone. One by one they appeared, invoices in hand, voices hard with the memory of broken promises. And suddenly the boutique with its velvet curtains and glowing candles was exposed for what it was. A stage set propped up by my funds, collapsing now that the hidden supports had been pulled away. Without my quiet payments, without the safety net, she had mocked even as she relied on it. The numbers turned against her, debts outweighing assets, overdue bills piling until even the glossiest display could not distract from the truth. The town, which had once admired her shop as a mark of sophistication, began to whisper of insolvency, of unpaid staff, of shelves left half empty. I picture Lara clutching her purse tighter as the whispers swelled, her fury masking the fear that the mask had slipped and there was no one left to hold it in place. Monica walked calmly back into her office, unshaken, leaving Lara outside with her rage and the gathering crowd, and I imagine my name on her tongue, not as the benefactor she once boasted of, but as the woman who left her with nothing but the truth she could no longer hide. When Lara threatened to take everything to court, her voice sharp with bravado, though her hands shook as she held the crumpled notices, Monica only folded her glasses and reminded her that the law is not moved by tantrums, that a daughter-in-law unsupported by the deceased has no automatic claim, and that every page in the file bore her own signatures alongside my steady records. The words hung in the air like a verdict, undeniable and final, and even Evan, who had so long bent himself to her temper, sat stunned in the corner, the stack of documents spread before him like a mirror of all the years he had chosen not to see. He turned the pages slowly. First the schedule of debts, then the email printed with her cold command to delete, then the neat photographs of invoices from the boutique, and last of all the handwritten statement I had left in my bedside file. When Monica pressed play on the voice note I had recorded that night under the hospital lights, my son's composure cracked, my voice carrying through the room with love stripped of apology, truth without bitterness, and he covered his face, as if to shield himself from a storm he had helped create. Later, when Lara stormed out, muttering promises of appeals that had no weight, Evan remained behind, his voice breaking, as he whispered an apology to Monica, thanking her for defending me when he had not, admitting that he had chosen silence because it was easier than standing tall. Days later he came to the cemetery alone, I am told, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his breath rising white against the granite where my name was etched. Neighbors said they heard him speaking softly, words caught by the wind, promises made with tears sliding freely down his cheeks. And though I was not there to hear them, I imagine the vow he gave was to honor what I had built, to respect the trust as it was written, and to raise his child with the dignity I had begged him to find. It was late when he finally rose from the graveside, and the earth there was damp with his grief, but perhaps also watered by the first seeds of resolve, a belated courage sprouting where silence had once taken root, and though it came too late for me to see, it was the beginning of the sun I had always hoped would appear. When the envelope was opened and my handwriting met Evan's eyes, I imagined the room fell still, because a voice from beyond carries a weight no living argument ever could. And in that letter I gave him not reproach but release. I told him that he was my son and always would be, that though disappointment had carved deep lines into my heart, love had never abandoned him, and I wanted him to walk free of the chains Lara's temper had fastened around his life. I reminded him that love without respect curdles into debt, that affection cannot survive when it is twisted into obligation, and that he must learn to tell the difference if he ever hoped to find peace. My words were tender but unwavering, a mother's blessing given with eyes unclouded at last. And as the letter was read, the trust began its quiet work beyond the walls of Monica's office. The library received funds for textbooks, their crisp pages waiting for the hands of children who would never know my name but would feel the gift of knowledge. The coat drive was replenished before the first frost. Neighbors who had once brought soup to my porch, now passing on warmth to families who needed it most. The Women's Shelter Fund grew sturdier, its beds filled by those seeking refuge from storms, not unlike my own, finding in its walls a compassion that would not fail them. Lara received nothing more than what was already owed, her name etched into the schedule of debts, like an unavoidable echo of her own choices, and for once she could not twist it, could not erase it with a hissed command to delete. The house, my savings, my legacy, all of it flowed along the channels I had carved with care, away from the grasping hands that had mistaken my patience for weakness. And so, in Cedar Glen, peace settled not as silence, not as the brittle hush of secrets endured, but as a steady calm, the kind that follows a storm once the air has been cleared. I did not leave hatred behind, only the honest sum of what was borrowed and promised to be returned. And in that arithmetic, there was justice enough. Evan, free at last to step forward without her shadow dictating his steps, could learn to walk in dignity, and I, though gone, could rest in the knowledge that my last word was not bitterness, but balance.